Amarachi was just asking a question, in a classroom where every other voice got answers. But when she spoke, the professor flinched, and the whole room laughed. A phone recorded it. The caption read, "Broken English, broken logic." What she did next turned the entire university upside down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The heat clung to the Lagos airport like an unspoken warning, but 17-year-old Amarachi Okafor barely noticed. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from something more sacred. Pride. In one she held a threadbare carry-on bag. In the other a manila folder with her scholarship letter from Danesbury University. Its crest embossed in royal blue. She had earned this through sleepless nights under candlelight, through exams taken on half-empty stomachs, through prayers whispered into pillows so her younger siblings wouldn't hear the hunger in her tears. "Don't let them shrink your voice," her mother had said, pulling her in close before the boarding gate. That hug had carried more than love. It carried expectation, resilience, history. 20 hours later, Amarachi stepped into the manic blur of JFK International. America was colder than she imagined. Not just the air, but the glances, the smiles that didn't reach eyes, the silence that felt louder than Lagos traffic. She adjusted her head wrap and clutched her manila folder tighter, as if the paper inside could protect her. At the airport shuttle pickup, she stood among other freshmen headed to Danesbury. Most had polished luggage with monograms and Bluetooth trackers. Amarachi's suitcase, wrapped in cling film, looked like it had survived a war. She stood out. She knew it, and they made sure she felt it. "So, are you from Africa?" a pale-skinned girl asked, with an exaggerated smile. Before Amarachi could respond, a boy nearby laughed. "She speaks English? That's unexpected." The words hung in the air like smog. Amarachi smiled, tight, forced, polite. Her throat ached to speak, but her mother's words echoed again. "Don't let them shrink your voice." So she stayed silent, saving her dignity like loose change in her pocket. The bus rolled through upstate New York's winding roads. Amarachi watched trees blur past, each mile taking her further from familiarity. When Danesbury's Gothic spires finally rose in the distance, it didn't feel like arrival. It felt like an audition. She was not walking onto a campus. She was stepping onto a stage where she hadn't read the script. Her dorm was perched on a leafy hill, its red bricks covered in ivy that looked more colonial than collegiate. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement. Students greeted each other with hugs, in-jokes, and loud declarations of past summers in Europe. Amarachi introduced herself in soft, measured syllables. Amarachi Okafor, from Nigeria. Her new roommate, Chloe Hastings, blinked twice. Blonde, freckled, and born in Connecticut wealth, Chloe nodded, but barely concealed her confusion. "Oh wow, that's like in Africa, right?" Amarachi said nothing. What else was there to say? That night, while Chloe unpacked high-end skincare and Bluetooth speakers, Amarachi sat on her bed reciting a Shakespeare monologue. Her voice was clear, her rhythm lyrical, her enunciation precise, but African. It carried the melodic cadence of Igbo speech, layered under British-taught English. She didn't know Chloe was filming from behind her laptop screen, smirking. "Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?" Amarachi whispered, not knowing that her words were already being sliced into mockery. By midnight, a group chat titled Dorm Days had a new message from Chloe. Video. Caption, African accent. Morning came wrapped in sunlight, and the illusion of normalcy. Amarachi stood in front of the mirror adjusting her scarf, rehearsing her smile, reminding herself that this day marked the beginning of a dream. She checked her phone for orientation details, and froze. 97 unread messages. 2 missed calls from unknown numbers. A message from a girl in the dorm. "Hey girl, you're famous now." Confused, Amarachi tapped the link. Her voice, her monologue, her accent, it was everywhere. Edited clips, zoomed-in rewinds, looping her pronunciations. Her face plastered on the Danesbury campus forum under the tag, Queen of Broken English. In one meme, a cartoon speech bubble read, "Romeo, wherefore art thou, because." The laughter that had greeted her as she walked into orientation earlier wasn't welcome. It was ridicule. She hadn't known it then. But now, watching her own face being used as entertainment, she felt something deeper than shame. She felt betrayed. She had come here to learn, to speak, to belong. Instead, she was a punchline. Her hands trembled again. But this time, not from pride. As her stomach twisted and her ears rang with phantom laughter, Amarachi's phone buzzed again. A private message from a stranger. If you thought that was bad, wait till they release the second video. Shadows seemed to lengthen in the dorm room. And Amarachi knew. Her fight had only just begun. The corridors of Danesbury's English department were lined with glossy portraits of past faculty. White faces, white beards, white laurels. Amarachi moved through them with a heavy step, her syllabus clutched like a shield. Her first day in Western literature, Origins to Modernity, was supposed to be quiet. She had promised herself be invisible, but brilliant, speak only when necessary, make no waves. The classroom was shaped like a miniature amphitheater. Semicircular tiers with wood desks that smelled of decades-old varnish. Students filed in with MacBooks, branded water bottles, and relaxed confidence. Amarachi chose a seat near the back, away from the professor's direct line of sight. She hoped the distance would soften the inevitable impact of her voice. Dr. Lynn Patterson entered with her usual swiftness, blazer crisp tone clipped and eyes scanning the room like a hawk in search of vulnerability. The screen behind her displayed today's topic: Othello tragedy, otherness, and the colonial gaze. Amarachi's breath caught. Othello, the Black Moor. Misunderstood, exiled, destroyed. The irony didn't escape her. The lecture began with predictable observations: jealousy, manipulation, Desdemona's innocence. Students chimed in confidently. Chloe was there too, just 2 rows down, chewing gum like it owed her something. She didn't look back at Amarachi once. Still, Amarachi could feel her presence like static electricity, palpable and dangerous. Half an hour in, the professor posed an open question. How do we understand Othello's fall from grace in the context of language and identity? Silence stretched across the room like a dare. Amarachi hesitated. Her heart pounded. She remembered her mother's voice, the viral video, the sleepless night. But something in Othello's name, his very displacement, called her forward. She raised her hand. The professor raised an eyebrow. Yes. Amarachi? She stood slowly. Othello's fall isn't just a result of Iago's manipulation, she said, her accent crisp but undeniably Nigerian. It's rooted in the way Venetian society perceives him: as foreign, as barbaric. His language is his bridge, but also his prison. The tragedy is that even when he speaks their tongue, they still see him as other. A beat of silence. Then another. Not the kind that follows awe, the kind that precedes discomfort. A boy in the front row, Eli, slick hair, varsity jacket, turned to the student next to him and whispered just loud enough. Bro, do you hear subtitles or am I broken? Soft chuckles spread like a ripple in poisoned water. Amarachi's chest tightened. Dr. Patterson did nothing, didn't flinch, didn't chastise. She simply returned to her lecture, as if Amarachi's insight and the insult that followed had never happened. Amarachi sat down, numb, her throat burned with swallowed rage. She didn't hear the rest of the lecture, only the echoes of the laughter. The betrayal wasn't in the mockery, it was in the silence that followed. The silence from the professor, from Chloe, from every student who looked down, instead of up. Back in her dorm, Amarachi stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop for hours. Outside her window, golden leaves swirled in gusts. But inside, the room felt frozen in time. Finally, her fingers moved. When they hear my accent before my ideas. That's what she typed at the top of the page. She poured herself into the draft, writing of growing up with British grammar books and African rhythm in her tone, of being laughed at for the same English she was praised for back home, of feeling like her identity was a performance graded by white comfort. She didn't name names, she didn't attack, she just told the truth. Raw, unfiltered, and when she finished, she didn't post it. She saved it in a folder labeled Maybe. Because that's how she felt. Maybe brave, maybe broken. From the bathroom, she heard Chloe on a FaceTime call. Her voice drifted in. Yeah, she tried to do the whole woke African poet thing in class today. I'm surprised the professor didn't need Google Translate. Amarachi's fingers stiffened on the keyboard. The betrayal cut deeper now, not just because of the cruelty, but because it was casual, thoughtless, effortless. Chloe continued, unaware her voice carried. And she keeps journaling, like she's writing the next Roots or something. I wish I could record her again, but she's on to me now. Amarachi closed her laptop gently. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The tears would make it real. And right now all she wanted was to believe that this was just a passing storm. But doubt crept in. Why try to speak when your words were twisted? Why contribute if the room only heard your rhythm, not your meaning? Was this what her mother had feared? She lay in bed, the soft hum of Chloe's privileged cruelty buzzing through the walls. The light from her laptop glowed faintly in the corner, the blog draft still open, still waiting. Then her phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. Nina Howard, TA, Western Lit. Can we talk about what happened today? I saw everything. Amarachi sat up slowly. Nina? The TA who always seemed buried in grading, and never looked twice at anyone. Why her? Just as Amarachi began typing a reply, another notification appeared, this time from the campus group chat. A new message. A new video. From Chloe. Captioned, "Welcome to African Literature." And this time, it wasn't just Amarachi's voice. It was a deep fake, edited with tribal music, and even her face distorted. The laugh track had already begun. The sun hadn't yet risen when Amarachi opened her eyes, but her body had already given up on sleep. Her phone was still buzzing under her pillow, vibrating with likes, comments, tags. Her ears rang with digital laughter she hadn't yet heard. But she felt it, deep in her marrow. She finally sat up, cradling her phone like a loaded weapon. One notification blinked at the top. "You've been tagged in a post by A. Danesbury Digest." She tapped. The screen exploded with mockery. A low-resolution video. Her face overexposed. Her voice distorted to sound cartoonishly foreign. Someone had added clapping emojis to punctuate her pauses and layered in tribal drumming beneath her words. The caption read, "POV. When the Queen of Broken English teaches you Shakespeare." It had over 4,000 likes. In the comments, students argued about whether her accent was real or exaggerated. Others joked she was the next campus comedian. One said, "She should start a YouTube channel, Grammar with Grandma." Another, "It's giving Lion King narrator." The laughter was layered with cruelty. But worse, it was normalized. This wasn't anger. This was amusement. The kind that strips dignity without drawing blood. The meme spread fast. It landed on Danesbury's anonymous confession page, TikTok parody accounts, even a sorority group chat that hadn't interacted with her once in real life. Amarachi wasn't just mocked. She had become a symbol of difference, of foreignness, of discomfort they could laugh away. And then it happened. She saw a repost from a black student, a sophomore named Jamal, who she once thought might understand. His caption read, "Not gonna lie, she makes us look bad. I can't even defend this one." It sliced deeper than any white student's joke. Her own. She hadn't expected that. Amarachi closed her phone and sat in the darkness, unable to breathe for a moment. It wasn't just racism. It was cultural rejection. A disowning. Later that morning, Nina Howard met her outside the English building. The teaching assistant looked different in daylight, no longer an accessory to the professor, but a woman carrying stories behind her eyes. "I saw the video," Nina said gently, falling into step beside her, "and the one before it, and the whispers in class." Amarachi didn't respond. Her silence wasn't apathy. It was survival. "When I came to Danesbury," Nina continued, "I spoke with a Mississippi drawl, so thick my advisor asked if I'd take an ESL. I was born in Mobile." Amarachi blinked, surprised. "They said it jokingly," Nina said, "but jokes can bruise too." I started flattening my voice, speaking slow, practicing neutrality. Took me years to realize they weren't making fun of how I spoke. They were policing who I was. Amarachi whispered, "So what did you do?" "I got quiet for a long time," Nina admitted. "But then I wrote. And when I couldn't write, I read the voices of those who did. Audrey, Baldwin, Achebe. I reminded myself that my mouth belonged to centuries of survival." Those words hung in the air between them. A fragile bridge. Nina touched Amarachi's shoulder. "You don't have to fight loud, but don't let them steal your voice." It should have comforted Amarachi, but all she felt was exhaustion. Inside her dorm, Chloe sat on the edge of her bed scrolling TikTok. She looked up with a sugary smile. "Girl, you okay? That video's crazy. People are saying you should sue." She paused. "If it helps, I think your accent is cute." Cute. Like a puppy. Like a novelty. Amarachi didn't respond. She knew this game now. Chloe wasn't innocent. The first video had come from her phone, and though she played the part of the caring roommate, Amarachi had caught glimpses. Chloe laughing into her phone when she thought Amarachi wasn't watching. Whispering behind closed doors, clicking send faster than most blink. The betrayal was so clean, so polished, it became invisible to everyone but the victim. By midweek, Amarachi noticed the divide tightening. In the dining hall, the few African students nodded to her with solemnity, but stayed distant, afraid her spotlight might burn them too. The Black American students were more complicated. Some gave her polite half-smiles, others ignored her altogether. One girl muttered, "She doing too much," as Amarachi passed. Even among her own, she didn't belong. The loneliness nested inside her ribcage like a stone bird, unmoving, unyielding. That night, Amarachi opened the blog draft again. When they hear my accent before my ideas. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She was tired of writing to herself, tired of speaking into a void. Then her inbox pinged. A new message. No subject line, just a name. Voices unmuted. The email opened with one line. "We saw your blog draft. Let's talk." Amarachi stared at the screen. Who were they? How did they get her draft? What did they want? Before she could process it, another notification popped up. This time from a different app. A Google Drive folder titled, Amarachi Content Collection. Shared publicly. Anonymous uploader. Inside, voice clips. Clips she never knew were recorded. Private moments. Her speaking in Igbo to her mother. All out there. For everyone. And the title at the top? African Soundboard. For your next roast. The internet hadn't just mocked her. It had archived her humiliation. The walls of Danesbury University's campus felt closer every day. Not like a home, but a container. Something polished on the outside, yet suffocating within. Amarachi moved through it like a ghost. Her body present but her voice buried beneath layers of shame, exhaustion, and quiet rage. Since the release of the African Soundboard folder, she hadn't spoken more than 5 words in public. Her classmates didn't look at her anymore. They watched her, like a spectacle, like a failure in motion. She avoided eye contact, skipped the dining hall, and no longer sat in the library's public areas. Her safe zones had shrunk down to the 4 corners of her bed and the blue light of her laptop screen. There, alone in the hum of late-night silence, she tried to, but even the words had stopped coming. Her voice, the very thing that had carried her across oceans and earned her a full scholarship, now felt like a liability. Then came the message. It arrived in her inbox without subject or sender, just a location pin and a short line. Voices unmuted. 8 p.m. Come alone. She hesitated. The Drive folder had taught her that privacy was a myth, that anything she said or shared could be twisted, and yet something in the simplicity of that message tugged at her. Maybe it was the name, Voices Unmuted. Maybe it was the fact that someone had read her blog draft and didn't laugh. They saw her. Whatever it was, it drew her out of bed and into the cool night air, her coat zipped to the chin, her heart pounding beneath layers of fear. She followed the pin behind the philosophy building, where the ivy grew thicker and the brick was worn smooth by time. The steel door in the back looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but when she knocked, it opened. Inside, the warmth hit her first physically and emotionally. The space was small but lived in. Foldable chairs circled beneath exposed pipes. There were hand-drawn posters taped to the brick walls. Accent nail ignorance. Your silence isn't polite, it's conditioned. And we're not broken, we're buried. It felt intentional, defiant, safe. 12 students turned as she stepped in. No one smirked. No one pulled out a phone. There were no whispers. Just recognition. A tall young man stepped forward. His voice grounded. Amarachi, right? I'm Malik. She recognized him. Malik Thompson. Former star of the debate team until a controversy the administration labeled as behavioral intensity. The real story was less vague. During a regional debate, he'd challenged a white teammate's microaggressions on stage. The team dropped him the next day. That was 2 semesters ago. Malik motioned for her to join the circle. Welcome to Voices Unmuted. As she sat down, the others introduced themselves one by one. A Somali girl majoring in architecture, a second-gen Chinese-American student who'd been mocked for their robotic cadence, a Mexican transfer who was told his Spanglish disqualified him from public speaking events. Their stories were stitched with different fabrics, but the wound was the same. Malik explained the rules. No recording, no judgment, no tone policing, only listening. Then he said the words that tightened the air. We read your blog post. Amarachi flinched. How? One of the students, a South Asian girl with green-rimmed glasses, smiled gently. We have a signal system. Our IT rep flags certain keywords: accent, ridicule, speech discrimination, and alerts us when posts or messages circulate on campus servers. Malik leaned forward. Your line about your voice being a bridge and a boundary. That shook us. Amarachi blushed. She had written that line at 3:12 a.m., tears crusted to her cheeks, thinking no one would ever see it. Malik continued. We want you to read it out loud. Right here, right now. Her pulse accelerated. Her throat tightened. Speaking in front of people. Again? After everything? Still, she reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the paper. Her hands shook. The first few lines came out stuttered. But soon her rhythm returned. Her voice found its base. She read about British textbooks in Nigeria, about how they taught her proper English that wasn't proper enough in America. She read about being punished for sounding African, and punished again for trying not to. She read about her mother's dreams wrapped in syllables Amarachi now feared to use. By the end, no one clapped. They didn't need to. Malik simply stood, walked over, and dropped something in her hand. A brass pendant on a leather cord.
This is Dawai, he said. It's from the Akan tradition, Ghanaian symbol for nurturing strength and self-respect. My grandma gave me mine after my suspension. Now I'm giving you yours.
The weight of it in her palm was heavier than it looked. It wasn't jewelry. It was armor. Before she could thank him, someone at the back said, You're our headliner. Amarachi blinked. What? We do an open mic every semester. This one's different, Malik said. The theme is unapologetic tongues. And you're what that theme means. Amarachi shook her head. No, I can't. You've seen what they did to me. If I speak again publicly, it's over. That's exactly why you have to. Malik said, You're not just Amarachi anymore. You're every student who stayed silent when their words were laughed into corners. The room nodded in unison. There was no applause, just a collective, quiet understanding. It was bigger than her. She hated that. She loved that. She didn't know if she was ready. For the next 3 days, Malik became her coach. He pushed her to write, not like a victim, but like a weapon. Don't give them soft, he said. Give them steel wrapped in velvet. They met in empty classrooms, under stairwells, on the hill behind the music hall. He made her say her monologue 10 times, then 10 more. Don't speak for them, he'd say. Speak from you. By the 4th day, her voice didn't crack anymore. It rang. He gave her performance notes, helped with posture, rhythm, tone, but most of all, he helped her remember who she was before Danesbury, before Chloe, before viral videos and whispered slurs. You're not a joke, he said once, voice low but certain. You are a reckoning. And then came the blow. On the day of the final rehearsal, Amarachi found an envelope in her campus mailbox. It had no return address, but the university seal was clear. Inside, a typed letter from the Office of Campus Harmony. We have been made aware of your scheduled participation in the Voices Unmuted Open Mic Night event. Given recent concerns from students regarding discomfort and emotional sensitivity, your appearance is under review. Public conduct that disrupts community well-being may result in temporary suspension or probation. Thank you for preserving a safe environment for all. Danesbury University Office of Campus Harmony. Amarachi turned the paper over and froze. There, in neat handwriting on a yellow sticky note. Speak too loudly, and we'll make sure this campus isn't your home anymore. No name, no signature, just a threat. It wasn't digital this time. It was real. Intimate. Controlled. A reminder, even your voice has boundaries here. Amarachi didn't show the note to anyone. Not yet. But that night, as she stood before the makeshift stage at open mic rehearsal, pendant heavy against her chest, she looked into Malik's eyes and whispered, What if I get expelled? Malik's reply came like a storm. Then let them know they had to silence you to survive you. And that was when Amarachi decided. She would speak, but not safely. Not this time. The night air wrapped around Danesbury's west lawn like a velvet curtain. Soft, thick humming with anticipation. Students crowded in rows of folding chairs, shadows flickering under string lights, strung between 2 bare trees. A makeshift stage stood at the front, wooden pallets covered with a single rug and a microphone tilted toward defiance. It wasn't a university-sponsored event. No banners, No faculty supervision, no polished introductions, just voices unmuted, a list of readers, and a space reclaimed for truth. Amarachi stood behind the stage, her fingers wrapped tightly around Malik's pendant. Her heart thudded with the same rhythm that had carried her across oceans. She had worn her best Ankara print head wrap, black turtleneck and jeans that made her feel grounded. Her eyes scanned the crowd, more people than expected. At least 200. Some stood at the back, phones already out. Some wore shirts with her face printed on them. Her viral face captured mid-sentence in the infamous dorm video. But now with bold red letters beneath, she spoke anyway. Malik appeared beside her, calm as ever. "They're not ready," he said softly, eyes scanning the sea of students. "But you are." She nodded, not trusting her voice yet. When her name was called, the crowd fell into hush. Amarachi stepped forward, her boots crunching the dead leaves beneath. The mic was taller than she expected. She adjusted it, her hands shaking only slightly, and then she breathed. "I call this piece," she said, letting her voice anchor in her chest. "My accent is not a mistake." Silence stretched. She began. "I was born in a tongue they taught me to tame." Her voice was steady, but layered. She wove English with Igbo seamlessly, syllables bending and flowing like music written by her ancestors. "In Lagos, my teacher said I was brilliant. In America, they say I'm hard to understand. But I will not shrink myself to fit inside your ears." Each line struck like a heartbeat. She described her childhood. The wooden benches of her Nigerian classroom. The soft click of chalk on slate. Her mother pronouncing perseverance with the kind of beauty that could break glass. She contrasted it with Danesbury's sterility. Cold professors, recorded laughter, edited videos that distorted not only her voice but her being. "Tell me, what do you hear? When I say I am here? Do you hear defiance? Do you hear threat? Or do you simply hear something you can't control? And label it broken?" Her voice began to rise, a drumbeat of her own making. "Because if my voice unsettles you, good." It wasn't born to lull. It was born to remind. Then she paused. A long, heavy silence. She looked out into the crowd, straight into the lens of one phone, and said in Igbo, slow and clear, "Naman gora manka oburuna, iga yi ekwo, okunuzo, hamanra ike inakwe, iga inanuzo, ha agayi echef." My father told me, if you cannot speak in a way they will accept, speak in a way they will never forget. For a moment, the world held its breath, and then applause, thunderous, raw, unapologetic. The students stood, some wiping tears, others shouting her name. Someone threw a fist in the air. Another chanted, "Say it again." Malik was smiling, wide, proud. Even Nina, from the back, stood with both hands over her heart. Phones lit up like stars. Someone had streamed the entire performance live on Instagram. Within an hour, the clip hit 30K views. But the next morning, it crossed 100,000. And by evening, Amarachi Okafor was trending. Black Twitter crowned her the accent queen. Hashtags spread like wildfire. "Speak like Amarachi." "Unmuted tongue." "My accent is power." People started stitching the video with their own accents. Haitian, Trinidadian, Congolese, Jamaican, adding verses of resistance, turning her monologue into a chorus of global identity. It should have felt like victory. And in some ways, it did. Amarachi smiled for the first time in weeks when she saw a little girl in Texas recite her lines for a school project. She got a message from a woman in London. "You gave me permission to stop apologizing for who I am." A DJ in Johannesburg mixed her final lines into a lo-fi beat. Even Danesbury responded, reluctantly. Some professors emailed her, congratulating her on bold expression. Others accused her quietly of causing division. One, unnamed but familiar, wrote in the faculty newsletter that the campus was being overtaken by activism disguised as art. Still, the wave didn't stop. She was invited to speak at a regional black student conference hosted by Rutgers. They asked her to keynote, all expenses paid. Mina and Malik helped her prepare. Yet Amarachi moved through the praise like someone still nursing invisible bruises. Because Chloe hadn't said a word. Not a text. Not a glance. She sat in the same dorm room, now strangely silent, pretending the world wasn't shifting. Amarachi wondered if Chloe felt guilt, or just resentment at being outshined. Then, just as Amarachi began believing in momentum, the letter arrived. It was in her campus mailbox again. Same beige envelope. Same cold font. Notice of disciplinary hearing. Student. Amarachi Okafor. Reason. Disruption of campus harmony. Details. Unapproved public performance resulting in student complaints. Date. Redacted. Location. Office of Conduct and Ethics. There was no sticky note this time. No handwritten threat. The letter was enough. She stared at the lines, her fingers stiff. Disruption of campus harmony. Her words, her accent had unsettled them so deeply, they now called it a violation. The very thing that had finally given her power was now the excuse to take it back. Amarachi turned the page over, just as a shadow fell across her dorm desk. Chloe stood in the doorway, holding a new envelope, silent, her eyes wide. She handed it over, and for the first time in weeks, her voice cracked. You should see what they sent me too. Amarachi opened it. Her name wasn't on the paper. But the video inside? It wasn't her monologue. It was her mother recorded secretly on a video call spliced into a new meme. This time, they hadn't just come for Amarachi. They had come for her bloodline. The room was colder than it should have been. A bland gray conference space in Danesbury's administrative wing. Stripped of warmth, stripped of bias, or at least pretending to be. The walls were bare. The lights too bright. Amarachi sat in a hard plastic chair at the center of the semicircle of faculty members, student representatives, and administrative staff. A long polished table separated her from them, as if her presence needed to be contained. A microphone stood awkwardly in front of her. Unnecessary, she thought. Her voice had already carried far enough to warrant this. She adjusted the collar of her black sweater and folded her hands tightly in her lap. The panel chair, a woman with silver-streaked hair, and the tone of someone who had long since stopped listening, cleared her throat. We are here today to review concerns raised regarding a recent event in which Miss Amarachi Okafor delivered a public performance that, according to multiple reports, disrupted campus harmony and made several students feel uncomfortable. Amarachi said nothing. They didn't mention the applause. They didn't mention the thousands who stood up to her words. Just the discomfort. A male panelist leaned forward, fingers steepled. Ms. Okafor, would you please explain the intent behind your performance? She looked him straight in the eye. To be heard. He scribbled something in his notepad without responding. Another woman leaned in. Your use of Igbo, while culturally significant, wasn't translated during your speech. Can you explain why you chose to use a non-English language in a public setting? Amarachi's voice stayed calm. Because I wasn't speaking to just one kind of audience. Some things don't need translating. They need listening. A flicker of discomfort passed across the table. One panelist, the youngest, bit his pen, clearly uncomfortable with the process but unsure how to stop it. The chair cleared her throat again. We'd also like to address the issue of tone. Several students submitted statements, indicating that your delivery came across as confrontational, perhaps even aggressive. Amarachi leaned forward slightly. Aggressive is not a synonym for assertive, unless you only apply it to students who sound like me. A silence followed. That silence, the weight of unspoken things, was familiar now. The door opened. Chloe Hastings stepped in. Amarachi's breath caught for just a moment. Chloe took the witness chair, her blonde hair perfectly curled, her cardigan soft and neutral, like everything about her presence was curated for innocence. The panel chair smiled gently. Ms. Hastings, thank you for joining us. Chloe nodded. Of course, I wanted to support the process. They asked her about the video, the memes, the roommate relationship. Chloe twisted her fingers, her voice quivering just enough. I never intended to hurt Amarachi. But sometimes, her tone made me feel unsafe, like she saw me as part of some oppressive system. Did she threaten you directly? A panelist asked. No. But sometimes silence is threatening too. The way she would just look at me. Amarachi didn't move. Not even when Chloe added, and I think her blog, honestly, it felt radical, like it was trying to start something. The folder on the table opened. Amarachi's printed blog post was slid across the table like a piece of evidence in a trial. One line circled in red ink. My accent is not your permission slip to colonize my voice. The panel chair read it aloud. Do you believe this suggests hostility toward the broader student community? Amarachi inhaled slowly. It's a truth, not a threat. The panel shifted uncomfortably. A new voice broke the tension. Nina Howard stepped forward, her ID badge swinging from her lanyard like a sword. I'd like to speak. The chair hesitated. Miss Howard, you are not. She is my student, Nina said, her tone sharper than they'd expected. And if you're going to dissect her courage, you're going to hear mine first. Silence again. But this time, it belonged to Nina. I have watched this institution pretend to value diversity while punishing difference. I've watched students be told to express themselves and then get sanctioned for doing exactly that. You all sat here and listened to a white student talk about feeling unsafe because someone looked at her. But where were you when Amarachi's voice was turned into a meme? When her culture was mocked on your own server? No one answered. She didn't come to this school to offend you, Nina continued. She came here to learn, and instead you taught her that authenticity has a price tag. Amarachi's throat tightened. Nina stood taller than anyone in the room. When Nina finished, the panel fell into a murky silence, whispering among themselves. The young man on the end looked directly at Amarachi and nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The chair finally spoke again. Thank you, Ms. Okafor. We will deliberate and contact you with a formal decision. In the meantime, she paused, as if unwilling to say it. You are temporarily suspended from representing Danesbury University at any external conferences, including the Rutgers Black Student Assembly. Amarachi blinked. That had been her win. Her foothold back into hope. Now revoked. Pending final review, the chair added quickly. This is not a disciplinary record, merely a pause. But Amarachi heard what they didn't say. She had been silenced again. Not digitally, not publicly, but procedurally, professionally. And this time they wrapped the muzzle in bureaucracy. She gathered her things. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She didn't flinch. She stood, nodded once, and walked out of the room. In the hallway, Malik waited. When she didn't speak, he didn't ask. She held the pendant around her neck and whispered, just loud enough for only him to hear. They called it radical, but it was just my truth. That night, she received a new email. Subject: reconference opportunity. Alternative venue offer. Body: we heard about the Danesbury decision. Rutgers has offered to host you independently. We'll cover the cost. But there's one condition: you speak without representing Danesbury. Are you still willing to speak, even if it means cutting ties? Below that, a bolded question: can your voice exist without their platform? By Monday morning, the air across Danesbury University felt thick, like humidity had collected over every hallway, every classroom, every anxious mind. The hearing's outcome hadn't arrived yet, but the verdict was already being felt in whispers and sidelong glances. Amarachi walked across the quad, her shoulders squared and her chest closed off, as though exposure might leak from her pores and be swallowed whole by the campus. Students slowed their steps when she passed, a murmur trailing behind like exhaust. In clusters beneath the magnolia trees, gossip fluttered. Some voices were angry, calling for her suspension's finalization. Others were supportive, echoing her monologue in hushed tones, as if it were too dangerous to speak out loud. Groups holding webcams formed a corridor of silence, punctuated with signs. My voice matters, I am not a joke. Accent nail violence. These silent protests weren't shouted. They were held against chests, pressed tight, resolute. At least 30 students stood in straight lines near the English department entrance, lips taped red, expressions solemn, banners fluttered in their hands. She didn't disrupt us. She reminded us. Cameras clicked. The silence snapped louder than any chant. Yet for every student who stood in solidarity, 2 more recoiled. In dining halls, white students joked, glad they showed her the door. In study lounges, Black American students whispered, she's brave, but too drama. Even some international peers dipped their heads when she passed, eyes avoiding contact. The definition of campus harmony had become elastic, stretching to include silence, betrayal and fear, all in the name of comfort. Amarachi's refuge dwindled. The dorm hallways felt too bright. Dorm rooms too cramped. The quad too exposed. She retreated into solitude, her door closed, her posture small. Chloe skirted around the edges of her room like guilty dust, too afraid to apologize, too ashamed to speak. Rooms across the hallway pulsed with laughter and playlists. Her side remained silent. Daytime turned into stillness. Late nights carried the weight of unread messages and unreadable silence from Rutgers. The offer still waited, bright and hopeful in her inbox. Yet each time she looked at it, she felt a hollow ache. Was she willing to give herself to a platform alone? On Wednesday afternoon, there was a soft knock on her door. A pause, then Nina Howard stood there, black messenger bags slung over her shoulder. Holding a brown manila envelope, thick with letters. "These are for you," Nina said, placing them gently on the desk. "From students across campus, letters from those who saw in your story their own." Amarachi stared. She touched the stack. Thin pages, foreign handwriting, tears she hadn't shed. Nina offered a small, understanding look and turned to leave. She said nothing else, but the gesture said everything. Amarachi sat down and began to read. Letter after letter filled the silence with truth. A Malaysian first-generation economics student wrote about being told to speak proper English at poster sessions, by professors, by peers until she stopped volunteering in class. A Somali engineering major wrote, "I paused my scholarship because I was so terrified my accent would cost me credibility." A Jamaican queer poet described how peers teased her rhythms until she braided them into poems behind closed doors. A Nigerian freshman confessed she had changed her given name because it sounded too foreign. Each letter stabbed her heart but lit a fire there too. She wasn't alone. Her story was mirrored, amplified, echoed, uncomfortable yet necessary. Late that night, Amarachi set up her phone and hit record. The first episode of what she would eventually call Accent Diaries. She spoke in the dark, her face lit only by the camera. She recounted the dorm video, Chloe's betrayal, the hypermediatized humiliation, the hearing's verdict. She didn't dramatize, she testified. She spoke directly into the lens. "My accent isn't a punchline, it's my history." She ended with her own invitation. "Speak with me if you've ever felt erased." When she blinked into tears, because vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. By dawn, the video had 60,000 views. By noon, 102,000. Her inbox flooded. Stories poured in. A Kenyan grad student sent voice notes about being corrected by her peers in study groups. An Afro-Caribbean international wrote about being mocked for her vowels. An Indian-American writer attached a poem on code-switching pain. Each entry built momentum. Every voice added weight. By Thursday afternoon, Amarachi posted again. Episode 2, Letter Reads and Shared Stories. She recorded herself reading aloud from the letters Nina had brought. Tears, laughter, solidarity. She credited each author by initials for privacy and hoped anonymity would offer safety but not silence. By evening, the playlist views soared. Comments poured in. "I watched this with my mom. This changed my mind. I called my school board." She posted episode 3 the next morning. Why Accent Diaries exists. She spoke softly but clearly. "So my voice keeps them awake. So be it." The hashtag #WeSpeakToo turned into a slogan. TikTok creators stitched her speeches with clips of global accent. Teachers in Ghana shared clips in classrooms. DJs in Chicago sampled her Igbo closing line in music remixes. The movement scaled beyond Danesbury. It was no longer just a campus controversy. It was cultural reckoning. Yet Danesbury University remained silent publicly. Official statements were delayed. Emails from administrators hung with vague language. "We affirm free expression. We are reviewing. We are committed to the safety and inclusion of all students." Carefully curated neutrality, but the silence shouted. Meanwhile, rumors spread. One senior posted in a faculty newsletter, "Woke activism disguised as poetry is disrupting learning outcomes." Another professor emailed undergrad chairs, "Beware the elevation of performance over pedagogy." Students overheard board members discussing restricting student-led events. The word precedent echoed. Despite internal backlash, the external world watched. That Friday afternoon, a national news outlet reached out. Her video inbox pinged with official correspondence. Urgent media request. Subject: leave interview tonight on youth resistance and institutional accountability. Body: we admire your work with Accent Diaries. We'd like to book a primetime segment tonight. We'll ensure you are safe, legal support is available, and editing is with your approval. We stand with your story, not the university's actions. The email was signed by a senior producer at a major national network. Amarachi's heart raced. Recognition spilled into possibility. She had gone from viral disgrace to invited authority. But with opportunity came pressure. Doubts raged. Can I trust them? Will Danesbury retaliate? Am I ready to speak under that spotlight? Her screen glowed with the options. Accept, decline, ask more questions. She breathed in, steadying herself. She thought of the letters from students, of the protest signs, of Nina's reassurance. She felt purpose stirring in her chest like new breath. Just as she moved her cursor to reply, Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. If you do the interview, we leak everything. Your visa status, your mother's job, your father's immigration history. You had your 15 minutes. End it now. Her breath caught. Her fingers froze. Her world, once crashing in laughter, was now threatened in silence. Amarachi stared at the threat. Anonymous, personal, loaded with fear. She looked at the offer again. Can your voice exist without their platform? The cursor blinked, and Amarachi realized the question wasn't rhetorical anymore. The dressing room was colder than Amarachi expected, despite the warm lights surrounding the mirror. She stared at herself, face powdered, hair wrapped tightly, pendant from Malik resting against her chest. A stylist had gently asked her if she wanted to neutralize her accent for the segment. She had smiled politely and said nothing. She had come here to speak, not to shrink. The producer peeked in with a headset. 3 minutes, Amarachi. You ready? She nodded, more to herself than anyone else. This was not the campus quad. It was not her dorm. This was prime time. She would be watched by millions. As she walked into the studio, cameras whirred. A host with white teeth and well-practiced empathy greeted her with a firm handshake. The first question came fast. You've gone from being mocked for your voice to being called a voice of your generation. How does that feel? Amarachi looked into the camera. No nerves now. Just focus. I'm not here because I wanted attention. I'm here because they wouldn't stop listening when I didn't speak. They mocked me. When I did, they punished me. The host leaned in. What do you mean by punished? She inhaled. Microaggressions are small in name, but sharp in damage. They chip away at your confidence, your dignity, and your sense of safety. When I arrived in America, I spoke English perfectly, but it wasn't their English. So they laughed. They isolated me. And when I reclaimed my voice, they called it a threat. The audience in the studio went still. The host gave a subtle nod, and Amarachi continued. They say it's about tone, about delivery, but what they're really saying is, we will not accept your identity unless it's polished for our comfort. Her accent, rich and rhythmic, echoed clearly. No music behind it, no meme to mute it. Just raw cadence and clarity. The host wrapped the segment with a final line. Amarachi, thank you for showing the country what voice, courage, and truth really sound like. As the camera panned out, Amarachi stayed composed. But inside she knew something had shifted. She hadn't gone viral. She had gone visible. By the time she returned to campus, her social media had exploded. DMs flooded in. Messages from young girls in Sudan, professors in Australia, artists in Atlanta. Everyone had something to say. For the first time they said it to her, not about her. Yet while the world applauded, Danesbury simmered. The university issued a vague statement that afternoon. We celebrate student expression while maintaining an inclusive environment for all. We do not endorse divisive narratives. It was the statement equivalent of standing in the middle of a fire, holding a garden hose. Supporters were enraged. Critics felt validated. Professors who had praised her performance now backtracked, calling her media-trained and strategic. Chloe posted a story on Instagram. When activism becomes self-promotion, we all lose. Her followers, many of them from Greek life and legacy circles, echoed the sentiment. Someone posted a graphic meme of Amarachi sitting on a throne made of woke words, with the caption, Queen of Complaints. Another TikTok video played her MSNBC clip side by side with someone parodying her voice. Comments piled up. She's milking this for clout. She's a professional victim. Then came the physical reminders. 3 days after the interview, Amarachi opened her dorm mailbox and found an unmarked envelope. Inside was a page torn from a university handbook, with one phrase underlined in red ink. Students may be expelled for threatening campus integrity. Attached was a printed screenshot from her interview, with the words, "We're watching you." Campus police dismissed it as possibly a prank. Nina, furious, filed a formal incident report and demanded temporary security be assigned. For the first time in her life, Amarachi had to be escorted between classes. Some classmates looked at her like a celebrity. Others, like a liability. She stopped going to the dining hall entirely. Even in class, she could feel the surveillance eyes pretending not to look. Professors tripping over introductions, skipping over her name during attendance. The girl who sat next to her in Western Lit now changed seats. But Amarachi refused to retreat. She continued the accent diaries. Her latest video broke 200K views in a single day. She invited other students to speak. The platform became less about her and more about community. She filmed in quiet stairwells, whispered support to tearful international freshmen, published translated captions. Each episode was a rebellion. But the backlash didn't just stay online. It entered classrooms. During a midterm discussion on post-colonial literature, Malik, who now co-taught a peer workshop with Nina, brought up Amarachi's MSADC appearance as an example of modern cultural resistance. A student interrupted, "Why does everything have to be about race and accent now?" Another chimed in, "You people just want to be victims." The room went tense. Malik stood at the front, face calm, voice steady. "I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to challenge what you've accepted as normal." A few clapped. Others rolled their eyes. The professor overseeing the course, visibly anxious, ended class early. The next morning, Malik received a letter. Notice of suspension. Teaching assistantship revoked. Reason: classroom conduct deemed hostile and disruptive to learning environment. There was no hearing, no review, just removal. When Amarachi found Malik standing outside her dorm with the letter in hand, silent and staring at the ground, she asked what had happened. He handed her the paper. But what stopped her breath wasn't the suspension. It was the notepaper clipped to the back. One down. Who's next? And at the bottom her accent diary's tagline. Twisted. We silenced too. Danesbury University's Community Healing Forum was anything but healing. The lights inside the auditorium were dimmed to a faux intimate glow, and student volunteers moved briskly across the stage, setting up a row of empty chairs beneath a freshly printed vinyl banner that read, Voice Safety. Inclusion. The event had been pushed by the administration in response to the backlash following Amarachi's national interview and Malik's abrupt suspension. The intention, they claimed, was reconciliation, but the execution looked more like theater, an image management operation disguised as dialogue. Amarachi sat near the back, her chair pulled slightly apart from the cluster of others. She hadn't been invited to speak, despite being the central reason for the event. Not that she would have accepted. She hadn't received a personal apology, hadn't seen justice for Malik, hadn't even been approached by the organizers. Her name was mentioned in every flyer, every press email, and every tweet from the university account, but she was still voiceless within the official narrative. At exactly 6:30 p.m., Chloe Hastings stepped onto the stage. Her blonde hair was tied in a respectful bun, her navy blazer fitted and safe. The moment she took the mic, photographers shifted positions, phones lifted, faculty members leaned forward. It was her moment, or at least it was meant to look like one. "I've taken time to reflect," Chloe began, her voice trembling just enough to seem sincere, "on the ways I contributed to harm, to the pain I caused, intentionally or not." Amarachi narrowed her eyes. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Chloe had always been a master of tone. Her cruelty sugar-coated in smiles, her surveillance disguised as concern. And now, her apology scripted, staged and safe, was being received like gospel. "I'm sorry that Amarachi felt uncomfortable around me," Chloe continued, never once saying her full name. "I realize now that silence can be violent too. I'm learning. I hope we all are." The crowd applauded softly. Some students gave her a standing ovation. A faculty member wiped a tear and nodded, as if she'd just witnessed an act of generational courage. Amarachi sat still. Her hands were cold. The apology hadn't named what was done, hadn't acknowledged the videos, the memes, the recorded private moments Chloe had passed around like party favors. It wasn't an apology. It was a brand pivot. Later that night, Chloe posted a perfectly lit photo of herself at the podium, with the caption, "Accountability begins with acknowledgement." Still learning, still growing. Voice matters, growth mindset. The comments flooded in. "This is real Eily shit. Thank you for modeling what white people should do. Proud of you for being brave." Brave. Amarachi stared at the post for a long time. She didn't engage. She knew better than to argue with curated redemption. Chloe had weaponized the language of healing to protect herself from consequence. And it had worked. The next morning, an all-campus email landed in every inbox. The subject line read, "Announcing the Inclusive Speech and Expression Task Force." The email, riddled with platitudes, introduced a panel of 12 individuals, faculty members, student representatives, and external consultants. It was Danesbury's solution to the unrest. A performative gesture cloaked in progress. Amarachi scanned the names twice. Hers wasn't on the list. Not hers, not Malik's, not Nina's. The people who had lived the damage, who had carried the story into public consciousness. They were erased from the solution. Nina was furious. She stormed into her office, slammed her door, and immediately began opening decades worth of archived emails, student complaint logs, and departmental meeting minutes. She didn't say much at first, but her hands moved with purpose. Her eyes lit with fire. "I'm done waiting for their permission to tell the truth," she muttered. She called it the silencing ledger, a public archive of every ignored, dismissed, or buried complaint of linguistic, racial, and cultural bias at Danesbury over the last 10 years. She emailed former students, invited anonymous submissions, and even reached out to former faculty. In less than a week, the file had grown to over 60 pages. One student wrote about being laughed at by a professor during a presentation because his Nigerian accent sounded like a James Bond villain. Another shared how her roommate played a drinking game based on how many wrong pronunciations she could catch in one day. A third said her TA routinely skipped her questions in class discussions, claiming she was hard to understand. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same. Meanwhile, Amarachi kept building accent diaries. Episode after episode, she gave voice to the silenced. Students across the globe began submitting videos, voice notes, poems. A Ghanaian artist sent in a rap. A Haitian-American therapist submitted a letter to her younger self. A Somali student from the Midwest sent in a tearful clip, whispering, "You helped me forgive my voice." The project exploded. Influencers reposted. News anchors quoted her. Educational institutions began reaching out. Accent Diaries wasn't just viral, it was revolutionary. And yet back on campus, Chloe's platform flourished too. She'd become a pseudo-activist overnight, invited to panels, awarded Ally of the Year by a campus group she'd never interacted with before. Her carefully curated self-redemption arc became a case study in how to fail upward, especially when you fail with a smile. Still, Amarachi refused to be baited into a public feud. Instead, she focused on the real battle, truth. That's when Malik approached her again. It was a Friday night. They sat under the old sycamore tree, near the library, the same place she had first practiced her monologue. "We need to do more," he said. Amarachi looked at him. His eyes weren't tired, they were focused. "We've said enough," Malik added. "Now we need to make them feel it." "What do you mean?" "A sit-in. At the literature building. All day. All of us." Amarachi hesitated. "They're looking for any excuse to retaliate." "They already have," he said simply. "This isn't about risk anymore. It's about reclaiming." They organized quietly. No flyers, just texts, messages passed by word of mouth, in study groups, during late-night meetings. Nina helped coordinate legal backing. Students from all backgrounds joined: immigrant, queer, black, undocumented, neurodivergent. Some wore Amarachi's viral quote on their shirts: "If you can't hear me, it doesn't mean I'm wrong." At exactly 7:00 a.m., on Monday, 73 students entered the literature building and sat. They didn't chant. They didn't block doors. They simply filled the space with presence. Some read from Audre Lorde. Others wrote essays, sketched, or sat in contemplative silence. A camera crew from an independent student channel streamed live. By noon, Danesbury's sit-in was trending. And then, at exactly 12:47 p.m., the fire alarm rang. Students looked around. Malik raised a hand. "Don't move." Then came the voice over the intercom. "All students must evacuate the literature building immediately." No fire trucks arrived.
No smoke.
They stayed seated. 10 minutes later, security officers entered, wearing full riot gear. Helmets, plastic shields, batons. One officer barked, "This is your final warning. Failure to comply may result in disciplinary consequences." A hush fell. Phones lifted. Cameras rolled. Amarachi's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't leave. They hadn't broken a single rule. They hadn't even spoken. But their silence had become dangerous. A student near the front reached for her backpack to pull out her ID, and an officer moved forward to intercept her. And that's when a voice cut through the building. "You touch any of them, and I go to the press with the ledger." All heads turned. It was Nina, standing in the archway, folder in hand, fire in her posture. The officers paused. Nina took one step forward and lifted the thick stack of documents high. "This," she said, "is every ignored complaint, every buried truth, and every name this university hopes we'll forget. I press send, and your brand is gone. Amarachi's breath caught in her throat. The officer stood still. So did time. And then from behind the security team, a new figure stepped into the light. The dean. Face unreadable, hands clasped behind her back. She looked at Nina, then at Amarachi, then at the crowd, and she said only one thing. Everyone. Out. But no one could tell if she meant the students. Or the truth. The literature building, usually a hub of quiet study and casual coffee breaks, had transformed into the epicenter of reckoning. The walls that once confined colonial poetry and conservative lectures now bore banners scrawled in bold paint. Our voices, our power. Sheets of paper were taped to doors and windows with phrases pulled from Amarachi's now viral monologue. My accent is not your discomfort. Fluency isn't supremacy. Silence was never peace. Dozens of students sat on the cold marble floor, their backpacks propped against walls like sandbags in a war. The rotunda was packed with bodies, some leaning against columns, others curled in study positions, typing furiously on laptops. It wasn't chaos, it was strategy. Inside they designated teams, one for social media, one for food distribution, one to engage faculty allies. The sit-in had evolved from protest to precision. Outside, the lawn pulsed with tension. Amarachi stood at the edge of the crowd, a megaphone in her hand, heart pounding beneath layers of layered sweaters and stress. Her voice echoed through the quad like a song, steady and unwavering. We are not threats. We are the consequence of your silence. A cheer erupted. She continued. When you teach literature but ignore our stories, that is the real disruption. The crowd swelled. Camera crews from 2 local stations had arrived. Twitter live streams flickered. Hashtags trended globally. Across the lawn, faculty began to gather, some unsure, others determined. Dr. Weiss, a long-standing professor of feminist theory, stood beside Amarachi, nodding quietly. I should have spoken sooner, she whispered. Dr. Banerjee, from post-colonial studies, arrived next, then Professor Kim from the sociology department. One by one, faculty crossed the invisible line between observer and ally, standing shoulder to shoulder with students. Others remained conspicuously absent. Dr. Lynn Patterson, Amarachi's Western Lit professor, the one who had watched her be mocked without intervening, was nowhere in sight. Inside the building, Malik coordinated interviews with journalists from the student newspaper and a regional magazine. Nina passed out copies of the silencing ledger, now bound and watermarked with names and receipts. Faculty who had ignored complaints now stared at their own signatures in reprinted emails, proof of neglect. The document was no longer a whisper. It was evident. At 1:15 p.m., university police arrived. They stood at the periphery, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Their presence wasn't aggressive. Not yet. But it shifted the mood. For the first time, fear rippled through the students. Phones lifted. Voices dropped. Amarachi adjusted the megaphone. To the administration watching this, she said, "You can surround us, but you will never shrink us. Your discomfort does not determine our humanity." The police made no move. Yet, Malik emerged from the building with a USB in hand. He handed it to a reporter. "It's a video log of every student here, giving testimony. We're not just occupying space, we're archiving truth." By mid-afternoon, the lawn was packed. More than 300 students, parents, alumni, and faculty stood in collective silence. The image, a sea of bodies, signs and visible resilience, circulated worldwide. Danesbury's sit-in topped trending charts. International student unions sent messages of solidarity. A university in South Africa issued a public statement praising the courage of Amarachi and her peers. And then at 3:12 p.m., a statement from the university president appeared online. "We support student expression. However, all protests must align with university policies regarding safety and building use. We urge students to evacuate the literature building immediately. We are open to dialogue in appropriate private settings." It was the diplomatic equivalent of a shut door. Amarachi read the statement aloud into the megaphone. The crowd booed, not in rage, but in exhausted disappointment. Then, through a separate channel, Malik received a message. "The president is willing to meet, but only privately, off camera. No recordings." He showed it to Amarachi. She stared at it for a long time. "That's not a meeting," she said quietly. "That's a muzzle." Still, she didn't reject it outright. They knew what a standoff looked like. It began with smiles and ended in silence, or suppression. Together they composed a response. We will meet, but only if the conversation is transparent. No secrets. No sealed doors. Our truth doesn't need protection. No reply came. The standoff continued. At 4:26 p.m., a low rumble began to fill the air. It was a sound no one expected. The fire alarm. Inside the building, red strobes flashed. A siren wailed through the corridors. Students inside looked at each other, confusion rising. Malik stood, tense.
No one pulled that, he said.
Amarachi turned to the officers. Was that a drill? No one answered. Then came the official announcement over the intercom system. Emergency evacuation in effect. All occupants must exit immediately. The students held their ground, eyes darted to the exits, to each other, to their phones. The fire department never arrived. No smoke.
No heat.
No cause. Just orders. And suspicion. I think it's a forced shutdown, Nina said, appearing beside Amarachi. They're trying to dismantle without touching us. But the signal was clear. It wasn't sabotage of the system. The system was doing exactly what it was built to do. Evacuate resistance. As Amarachi prepared to address the crowd again, the quad lights flickered. Once, twice, then cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the lawn. And in the silence that followed, a single flashlight beam illuminated the main building steps. A silhouette stood at the top. The dean. In one hand, she held a bullhorn. In the other, a copy of the silencing ledger. She raised it high above her head and said nothing. Yet, the lights returned to Danesbury's campus the next day, but the energy never recovered. The university had not crumbled. Not publicly. It never does. Institutions don't fall from noise. They calcify under silence. And Amarachi, once the voice that reverberated through marble hallways and faculty inboxes, now found herself muted. Not with force, but with indifference. She walked into her Monday class 5 minutes early. No one greeted her. No one looked up. The professor nodded at everyone else as they entered. When she raised her hand to contribute, the professor glanced her way, paused, and then moved on without acknowledgement. The silence was loud. This wasn't exclusion. It was exile. Even Malik, though supportive in private, noticed the shift. They're pretending it never happened, he told her, standing just outside the literature building where the sit-in had been forcibly evacuated. You spoke too loudly, and now they act like they never heard you. It was crueler than outright hostility. Her inbox, once overflowing with media inquiries, student support and administrative backlash, was now reduced to automated emails, grade updates, course surveys, notifications about password changes. No one asked how she was. No one followed up about the ledger. The university president never responded to their public request for an open conversation. And Chloe? Still untouched. Still active on social media, where her captions about personal growth and listening as activism continued to rack up praise. Her apology had earned her a panel invite. Amarachi's monologue had earned her silence. In the dining hall, friends she once shared meals with now made excuses. Homework, deadlines, early classes. They'd nod when they saw her, but their eyes betrayed the unease. The same mouths that once cheered her voice now feared being caught beside it, as if her presence carried weight they didn't want to be associated with anymore. Even Nina began to change. She tried to hide it, but Amarachi could see it in her eyes. The exhaustion, the disillusionment. One evening, after a quiet voices unmuted meeting, where half the usual members didn't show up, Nina lingered behind. I'm sorry, she said. For what? Amarachi asked. For thinking this place could change. The next day, Nina resigned. Her resignation letter, posted quietly on her personal blog, spread faster than the university could bury it. She cited institutional hypocrisy, retaliation, and the performative parade of policy that protects image over impact. She ended with a final sentence that read like thunder. When truth becomes disruption, the institution was never built for justice. Her office door was cleared out within hours. Amarachi sat on her bed that night, staring at the wall. The pendant Malik had given her lay on her desk, its cord slightly frayed. The protest signs, the printouts, the poems, all packed away in a shoebox. The laptop still buzzed with messages from Accent Diaries viewers. But she hadn't recorded a new entry in weeks. She hadn't even opened the folder. She'd stopped writing, stopped speaking, stopped hoping. For the first time, she typed the words she had been avoiding. Transfer application deadlines for international students. Her cursor hovered over the search bar. Schools in Canada, the UK, even Ghana, anywhere but here. She didn't cry. There was no catharsis, just a dull, gnawing ache, like something sacred had been stolen, and she didn't know whether to fight for it or bury it. Malik found her the next day sitting alone on a bench near the quad fountain, the same one where she had once filmed her first Accent Diaries episode. He didn't speak right away, just sat beside her. "They want you quiet," he said finally. "They think if they ignore you long enough you'll go away." Amarachi didn't respond. Malik continued. "But you're not a whisper. You're a wound, and wounds either heal or scar, but they don't disappear." She looked at him. "What if I'm tired of bleeding for their comfort?" Malik nodded. "Then don't bleed. Burn." She exhaled. The wind rustled the leaves around them. A squirrel darted past their feet. Somewhere music played faintly from a dorm window. He stood. "You said you came here to speak. Then finish what you started. Don't give them the silence they prayed for." That night, she opened her laptop again, but not to write, to delete the transfer search. She wasn't done. Not yet. The following morning, Amarachi checked her inbox, expecting another automated message, something about midterms or housing updates. Instead, she saw this. Subject: Harvard University Diversity Summit. Keynote invitation. Body: Dear Ms. Okafor, we have followed your journey closely and watched with great admiration how your voice has sparked national reflection and global resonance. Your courage in the face of institutional resistance has redefined what academic bravery looks like. We would be honored to invite you as the keynote speaker for the upcoming Harvard University Diversity Summit. The theme this year is language, legacy, and liberation. All travel, accommodation, and honoraria will be covered. We await your confirmation with excitement and gratitude. Dr. Simone Rayner, Director, Office of Equity and Inclusion, Harvard University. Amarachi stared at the screen, frozen. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the message, as if waiting. The school that had denied her a seat at their own table now had to watch her ascend to the podium at a place that built its table for global ears. But just before she could reply, another email dropped. Sender: Danesbury Administration. Subject: Ugent University Trademark and Representation Guidelines. Body: Any media or public engagement referencing Danesbury University, including the use of its name in personal advocacy, projects or speaking engagements, must first be cleared by the Office of Public Relations. Unauthorized representation may result in academic probation or expulsion. They couldn't stop her voice. So now they were threatening her identity. The air inside Kennedy Hall shimmered with anticipation. Not from heat, but from history. Rows of oak seats, polished to perfection, were lined with some of the most respected names in academia. Scholars from Yale, Columbia, Stanford, and Oxford had gathered, mingling with students from every continent. Above them, a sleek banner stretched across the back wall. Harvard Diversity Summit, Language, Legacy, and Liberation. And in the center of that room, under the full, dignified weight of a crimson spotlight, stood Amarachi Okafor. Her palms were steady. Her voice had never been more sure. She didn't wear the robes of academia. She wore a fitted black blouse paired with high-waisted trousers. Her head wrap, boldly patterned in deep gold and rust red, framed her face like a crown. At her neck hung Malik's pendant, still frayed, still sacred. She looked out over the auditorium, not nervously, not anxiously, but intentionally. Then she began. "My name is Amarachi Okafor. I am not here because I won anything. I am here because I survived something." The silence that followed was reverent. She took a breath. Her voice carried not just in volume, but in gravity. "I survived the erasure of being heard, but not understood. The violence of having your words twisted into caricature. The punishment of speaking in a tone that made others uncomfortable, because it was unfamiliar." She paused. "I was born speaking English, but not yours. Mine was dipped in Igbo rhythm, and British schooling, then baked in Nigerian sun. And yet when I arrived on American soil, they said my English was broken. What they meant was, my mouth didn't sound like theirs." Scattered nods began to ripple through the room. Faculty leaned forward. Students sat taller. "You called my voice unintelligible, when really, it was inconvenient. You called my speech aggressive, when it was simply confident. You labeled my accent a barrier, when it was actually a bridge from colonized classrooms to colonial institutions." Her tone didn't waver. Her accent didn't flatten. She didn't adjust for the room. She demanded the room adjust to her. My voice is not yours to edit. My tone is not your permission slip. And this tongue, she pointed gently to her lips, does not belong to any committee or code of conduct. A hush fell again. No one dared move. I titled this speech, "You Don't Own My Tongue," because too many of us have been taught to believe we should rent our voice out for belonging. I will not do that. Not for Ivy League acceptance. Not for job interviews. Not for fragile comfort. From the corner of the room, one faculty member clapped once, then another. Soon, it spread. But Amarachi wasn't done. To every student who has ever been told that their English was off, let me say this. Your voice is not an error. It is a map. To every teacher who ever laughed when a name was hard to pronounce, you weren't correcting, you were colonizing. She let the weight of her words settle. Then finally, she said, I was suspended for being heard. Silenced for being seen. I was told my resistance was radical. And maybe it is. But I ask you, what's more radical than existing in a place built to erase you and refusing to disappear? There was a moment, one sacred, trembling moment, where everything stopped. And then the room erupted. A standing ovation, so loud it echoed off the stone walls like thunder in a cathedral. Amarachi didn't bow. She stood still, unmoving, unshaken. She had delivered not a performance but a reckoning. The offers came quickly. After the speech, academics crowded her. A professor from Stanford offered her a paid research residency. A civil rights nonprofit from New York extended a fellowship. A publisher from Boston slipped her a card, whispering, "We'd love to make this a book." Scholarships, internships, grants. It was a feast of opportunity. But Amarachi wasn't greedy. She accepted their praise. She acknowledged their offers. And then she did something no one expected. She returned to Danesbury. Not for them, but for herself. When asked why by a journalist, she answered simply, because if I don't walk back into that institution standing taller than when I left, they win. Her arrival on campus was met with silence. No protests. No celebrations. Just long glances and quiet awe. And then 2 days later an email landed in her inbox. Subject: Position Proposal. Accent Ambassador. Body: Dear Ms. Okafor, in recognition of your impact on cultural dialogue at Danesbury and beyond, the Office of Student Inclusion would like to offer you a symbolic leadership role for the upcoming academic year. Accent Ambassador. The position would include speaking engagements, peer mentorship, and advisory input on inclusive speech curriculum. While not salaried, it reflects our commitment to evolving our community with your voice in mind. Please consider joining us in this effort. She reread the line twice. Accent Ambassador. A role that didn't exist until her existence demanded it. A symbolic title, but also a subtle concession. As Amarachi considered her response, another message pinged. From Chloe. Subject: Request to collaborate. Upcoming university podcast on inclusion. Body: I think we could show the community what reconciliation really looks like. Let me know if you're open to a joint episode. Amarachi stared at the screen and whispered to herself, now they want my voice to cleanse their. The gates of Danesbury no longer felt like the threshold to erasure. They still loomed tall, iron wrought, ivy wrapped, but as Amarachi stepped through them again, there was no tremble in her step, no folded shoulders, no uncertain glances at the ground. Her suitcase rolled steadily behind her, the same way it had on that very first day, but the weight had changed. It no longer carried caution, it carried legacy. She walked across campus in silence, and silence greeted her back. Not the sharp, mocking silence she once knew, but a new kind, almost reverent, as if people weren't sure whether to speak first. They watched her pass. Some nodded. A few smiled. One student, hand clutching a worn copy of Accent Diaries Volume 1, murmured, "Welcome back." She nodded but didn't slow her stride. Respect had replaced ridicule, but weariness lingered, like a chill that clung to spring mornings. In her classes, professors called her name first, some with overcompensated friendliness, others with stiff professionalism. None dared ignore her now. Her blog had become required reading for the first-year seminar on culture and identity. Her videos were shown in orientation sessions. Her words, once branded disruptive, were now institutionalized. But Amarachi didn't mistake their inclusion for redemption. She knew a frame could be hung around a voice without ever hearing it. She accepted a position sponsored by alumni, workshop leader, free speech and identity expression, held every Thursday evening in the same lecture hall, where she had first been ignored. Now, the seats were full. International students, first-generation scholars, and even some faculty members attended. It wasn't about lectures. It was about excavation. She asked hard questions. What's the difference between a voice and a performance? When does free speech become selective speech? Who gets to decide what's neutral? Each session ended with shared stories. Each story added a new brick to the foundation she was quietly building. Not for Danesbury, but for the ones who would come after her. Malik was reinstated soon after her Harvard speech. The university issued a public apology, neatly typed and cautiously worded. But Malik didn't return for recognition. He returned for resistance. He joined Amarachi in the workshop. Together they restructured Voices, unmuted into an actual campus coalition, with funding, faculty sponsors, and protected rights. They no longer had to whisper their mission in side halls. They had office hours now. The symbolic title of Accent Ambassador had been offered with sugar-coated diplomacy. Amarachi accepted it not to validate the institution, but to subvert it from the inside. Her first act under the title, creating a database of student-recorded stories in multiple dialects and languages, archived online and projected on digital screens across the student union. Chloe, once hailed for her so-called bravery, was no longer on campus. Word circulated that she had quietly transferred to a liberal arts college in Vermont. No official announcements. No farewells. Just a removed nameplate from her dorm door and a deleted Instagram. No one celebrated. No one condemned. She had faded the way guilt does quickly, and without warning. Amarachi didn't mention her again. There were better things to focus on. At a university faculty luncheon, Amarachi sat at a table reserved for diversity and voice leaders. She was no longer the only black student present. She wasn't even the only international voice. Several students had since stepped forward, inspired by her defiance. Accent Diaries had grown from a campus blog to a digital collective of multilingual creators. Universities from across the country asked to license it. Yet, despite the accolades, Amarachi never let herself become ornamental. She still walked the halls with quiet dignity, not looking for applause, but no longer dodging gaze. She had become a landmark. And then, a week into the semester, something changed. A knock at her dorm room door. A quiet one. She opened it. Standing in the doorway was a girl. Slim, dark-skinned, hair in tight braids. She held her student ID in one hand, a carry-on suitcase in the other. Her name tag read, Chioma Eze. Amarachi blinked, confused. I think I'm your new roommate, the girl said, nervously. Amarachi's breath caught. Oh, she managed, stepping aside. Come in. Chioma entered the room with cautious movements, eyes darting to the corners, the furniture, the window view. She set down her bag and smiled awkwardly. Amarachi extended a hand. I'm Amarachi. I know, Chioma whispered, not meeting her gaze. Then after a pause, she looked up and spoke again, but this time in soft, careful Igbo. Please, do I have to speak English here all the time? Her eyes were wide, afraid, uncertain. Amarachi felt something inside her shift. She remembered the cold dorm room, the plastic-wrapped suitcase, the whispered jokes, the quiet cruelty of being called broken before she'd even introduced herself. She stepped forward and replied, also in Igbo, but warmer, fuller, stronger. No, not here, not with me. Later that night, as Amarachi scrolled through her inbox, a new message arrived. Subject Accent Diaries. Netflix rights inquiry. Body. Dear Ms. Okafor, we've been following your work closely and would like to explore the possibility of adapting Accent Diaries into a docu-series. Let us know a good time to talk. Executive producer, Netflix Originals. She turned to Chioma, now unpacking on the other side of the room. And for the first time since Danesbury had tried to silence her, Amarachi smiled without caution. Her voice hadn't just survived. It was about to echo louder than ever. In the quiet mornings, before classes stirred the rhythm of campus back to life, Amarachi and Chioma would sit on the windowsill, sipping tea from mismatched mugs. Chioma was quiet by nature, watchful, deliberate, easily startled by loud dormitory laughter or sharp English phrases that didn't translate cleanly in her head. But in the safety of their shared room, she spoke freely, in Igbo, in whispers that became stories. Amarachi listened carefully, never correcting, never pushing her toward performance. She remembered what it felt like to be forced to prove fluency before earning respect. So she didn't ask Chioma to adjust, only to trust. Your voice isn't in training, Amarachi told her one evening after Chioma expressed embarrassment over a classroom stumble. It's in translation. And that's not weakness. It's depth. Chioma smiled. It was the first time Amarachi had seen her teeth, bright and slightly gapped in the center, just like hers. Each week they practiced together. Not grammar drills, not accent reductions. Ownership exercises. Amarachi would have Chioma read poetry in both English and Igbo, then write her own version. Not as a student but as an author. Slowly, Chioma's voice grew confident, then lyrical. One day in early spring, Chioma stood at the front of the Free Speech and Identity Workshop and read aloud a piece titled, When the Silence Feels Like Home. She trembled, but didn't stop, and when she finished, the room rose to its feet. It was Amarachi's quietest moment, and her proudest. That same month, Amarachi's debut book, Unbroken Words, How Accent Became My Armor, hit shelves nationwide. Published by a prominent independent press, the collection interwove personal essays, monologues, and student testimonies. It wasn't memoir, it was movement in print. Critics called it a piercing manifesto of voice reclamation, and a modern anthem for the unheard. The cover, a watercolor silhouette of Amarachi speaking into a broken megaphone, its cracks glowing, became iconic. She received interview requests from major platforms, but chose only a few. I'm not a spectacle, she told her agent. I'm a map. The ripple of her work reached further than she could have planned. Danesbury's administration, pressed by public attention and internal pressure, revamped its first-year orientation for international students. What once began with passport checks and vague promises now included cultural respect seminars, dialect sensitivity workshops, and inclusive language policies. Professors underwent annual training on linguistic bias. No longer could a classroom silence a student without scrutiny. Even Nina returned, this time as a guest speaker in Amarachi's workshop series. She wore the same defiant energy but carried it differently now. Less like a burden, more like a beacon. Her lecture, titled Pedagogy of Powerlessness, traced how institutions extract stories and sanitize them for comfort. The room was packed. Faculty sat in the back row, taking notes not out of obligation, but finally humility. After the session, Nina pulled Amarachi aside. I wasn't sure I'd ever walk back into this building, she said, looking up at the stone archways of the literature hall. You didn't walk in, Amarachi replied. You returned. That's different. The moment felt full circle. But there was still one circle left to close. One morning, tucked between alumni invitations and editorial requests, Amarachi received a small envelope with no return address. Inside, a handwritten letter. The ink was shaky, the paper simple. No logos, no hashtags, just vulnerability. I never knew how deep my complicity ran. It was easier to perform remorse than to practice it. What I did to you wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. I'm not asking for public forgiveness. I just needed to say, I harmed you, and I regret it. Chloe. There was no grand gesture, no audience, no caption, just truth. Amarachi read it twice, then folded it carefully, placing it in the drawer beside her pendant and the first accent diary script. That night she wrote a single line in her journal. I forgive you, but I don't forget, and that is my boundary, not my bitterness. She never replied. Forgiveness, after all, wasn't a conversation. It was a decision. Weeks passed. Danesbury bloomed with a cautious kind of spring. Statues once overlooked now bore plaques in multiple languages. The student union held its first multilingual writers' showcase. For the first time in campus history, Igbo was heard over the intercom during an international celebration event. Then came an email with the subject line, Commencement Speaker Nomination, Amarachi Okafor. The message was formal, but the subtext was undeniable.
They weren't just offering her a microphone.
They were offering her the final word. But as she scrolled to the bottom of the email, another name caught her eye. Guest of honor, Dr. Martin Ellsworth, Chair of Western Literature. The same professor who once dismissed her voice in silence, now slated to sit behind her on stage. The morning sun filtered through the white peaks of the ceremonial tent on Danesbury's central quad. Rows of folding chairs, stretched like a sea, filled with graduates in pressed robes, parents gripping tissues and programs, faculty seated stiffly in tailored gowns. The podium, adorned with the school crest and a gold-trimmed microphone, stood at the front waiting. Amarachi Okafor stood just behind it, her speech folded carefully in one hand, her other wrapped tightly around the frayed cord of Malik's pendant. Her cap sat snug on her braids, and a bold kente stole draped over her shoulders, its colors vibrant against her deep blue gown. From her spot she could see them all. Some students smiled, others whispered. A few locked eyes with her, then quickly looked away. But she stood still. The same girl who once walked into orientation to the sound of laughter, now stood at the heart of the institution. Not as a survivor, but as a symbol. When her name was introduced, commencement speaker, Amarachi Okafor, the audience offered polite applause, but then she stepped forward, and something shifted. She didn't adjust the mic, didn't clear her throat. She began without hesitation. In my first week at this university, she said, I was told without words that my voice did not belong. A pause. A sharp silence. I was mocked not for what I said, but how I said it. My English wasn't broken. It just refused to bow. Heads turned. Familiar faculty members stiffened in their seats. But here's what they didn't know, Amarachi continued, her accent bold, her rhythm unfiltered. You cannot unwrite someone's story just because you don't like the sound of it. She glanced at the front row at Dr. Ellsworth, who sat with fingers interlocked, face unreadable. I come from generations of storytellers, from voices shaped in Lagos traffic, in colonial classrooms, in market songs, and church halls where language was layered, not erased. The crowd was listening now, not just out of duty, but transformation. I stand here today not to shame anyone, she said, eyes sweeping the crowd, but to remember everyone, because healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from naming. She unfolded her speech but didn't look down. She no longer needed it. I remember Chloe, not as a villain, but as a mirror. I remember every professor who looked through me, every student who laughed before they listened, and I remember how silence was used as a weapon, dressed up as professionalism. A sharp exhale from somewhere in the audience. Amarachi didn't blink. But I also remember Malik, who told me to burn instead of bleed. Nina, who risked her career for our dignity. Chioma, who found her voice in a language the system didn't teach. And I remember my mother, who when I boarded that plane from Lagos, whispered, "Don't let them shrink your voice." She paused. A single tear formed, but didn't fall. I didn't. I never did. Her hand brushed the pendant as she continued. This institution did not give me a voice. It gave me opposition. And from that resistance, I built resonance. Someone stood, then another, and another. Soon, the students were rising, rows at a time, robes rustling, tassels swinging. Parents followed, then faculty. Even the university president, reserved and often performative, rose, hands clutched before her like she understood. Finally, she was no longer in charge of the moment. The applause began. It wasn't explosive. It was reverent, measured. Like people understood that this wasn't about a girl who proved them wrong. It was about a girl who redefined what right meant. And then, before walking off the stage, Amarachi leaned forward one last time. They mocked my English, she said, her voice low, rich with steel. But I taught them humanity. She didn't bow. She didn't wave. She walked back to her seat, letting the silence behind her speak the loudest truth of all. This wasn't revenge. It was revolution. Later that day, the university posted the official video of the commencement address on its YouTube channel. The title read, "Within hours, it surpassed 1 million views." By midnight, national media outlets picked it up. By dawn, it had become the most viewed graduation speech in U.S. history, and in homes, schools, and dorm rooms around the world. Young people clicked play, and for the first time heard themselves in the voice of someone who had once been told to stay silent. No one should be shamed for the way they speak, or where they come from. Amarachi's story isn't just hers, it's a mirror for every voice ever silenced. If you've ever felt unheard, unseen, unwanted, type yes if you believe every voice deserves respect. Subscribe if this broke your heart.